I want to welcome you all to the Econ Department's second David S. Saurman Provocative Lecture of the semester. Our next lecture, we haven't nailed down precisely, but I think it's going to be on December 7th, December 5th, and our speaker will be David Henderson from the Naval Postgraduate School. I want to remind you to please turn off all your cell phones and electronic devices. Notice I still have an old flip phone. Also, after this evening's event, which runs until 6:45, you're welcome to join us at the Barstool Economists at Flames. That's the restaurant on the corner of 4th and San Fernando, across from the library, where we will continue the conversation. Our speaker will be there to field further questions, and there is also pizza and beer, which may attract some of you. Right? We're on? Okay. So it's a delight for me to be able to introduce Phil Magness, our speaker this evening. I actually first met him the summer of 2013. When he invited me to speak at a conference he was organizing for the Institute for Humane Studies. And he and I have an awful lot in common. First of all, both of us have a Ph.D. in history, not in economics. And yet both of us know a lot of economics. Moreover, one of Phil's topics is one of my topics, the Civil War. He has co-authored one book on that subject, entitled Colonization After Emancipation, Lincoln and the Movement for Black Resettlement, which came out in 2011. And he's co-authored a second book related more closely to economics, The Rules of the Game, How Government Works and Why It Sometimes Doesn't, which came out in 2012. Most recently, he has been at the forefront of people offering devastating criticisms of the work on income inequality by Thomas Piketty. He also, on top of all of this, and on top of teaching, organizes a lot of events for the Institute for Humane Studies. And I don't know how he fits it all in. He must not sleep very much. In any case, the official title of his talk for this evening is The Political Economy of Higher Education. I had a subtitle for the talk that for some reason the department nixed. The subtitle was How University and College Administrators Screw Students, Faculty, and Taxpayers. So please give a warm welcome to Phil Magness.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank all of you for coming out. I know I just learned that I'm the only thing standing between you and beer and pizza, so I will try to keep this lively and engaged, though, which is actually a fairly easy task for me, considering the topic is higher ed, and all of you have some sort of relationship to higher ed that's probably directly on your minds right now. I do want to jump into this topic, though, as something that's I find a both personal interest, but I think has huge policy and political economy implications for you as students, for those of us that teach in the academy, and those of us that have careers or research lives centered around academia. So I'm going to be jumping through a whole bunch of numbers, which means that by necessity the charts are going to be coming up on the big screen here, and I'll try to walk you through several of these because I do attempt to quantify my results. I want to give you a little bit of a background, though, on this project because it's building toward what I hope to be the third book project. Currently have a couple of basic articles out about what started as the history of higher ed in the United States, but has since morphed into a more general political economy discussion simply because history has created a path dependency for many of the institutions that we examine in higher ed. And if you know anything about reading the news on higher ed, you know anything about the dynamics of how higher ed is funded or discussed or talked, the conversation is often pretty dire. But I actually want to offer a little bit of optimism in what may seem initially like a fairly dire prediction of the state of higher ed. But jumping in, the main question I want to ask and present before you is this is an investigation of what is happening in higher ed right now. And as I go through a list of a couple different features of the higher ed system, I want to get you to raise your hand. Tell me if you've heard any of these things being alleged or claimed about higher ed right now. First off, that funding is in the decline for colleges and universities or students. There's a little bit of truth to that, but it's also a very mixed bag and nuanced question that we'll investigate. Second, who's heard about the decline of tenure for faculty? Or the resulting adjunctification is sometimes referred to, the increasing reliance on part-time faculty in place of tenure. That's a much more complicated issue, though, than it's even depicted. What about a third one? That academic jobs and jobs and intellectual careers are imploding. Anyone heard that? Oh, excuse me. And a fourth one. What about the administrators? This is something that all the faculty will raise their hands on. The administrators are taking over. This is probably the truest of the stories out there. So I make lots of friends with administrators whenever I raise this point. But nonetheless, it's a big feature of higher ed. And then the final one, who's heard that the higher ed bubble is about to burst? That maybe there's not going to be a university system in the same structure in a couple years. Well, this is the one that I'm the most skeptical of, and I'll get to the reasons for that at the very end of the talk. But I want to walk you through at least an empirical investigation of several of these features. So I'm going to lay out my argument in 4 steps of what I think a political economy explanation of the higher ed industry looks like. And I'll even give you a condensed or shortened version of this, which is basically that higher ed operates a lot like the government operates. It's a giant, expensive, bloated bureaucracy that's very inefficient at delivering things, but nonetheless it does deliver things that we use. So if you think about government in the same way, I come at it as a skeptic of government, but government operates in such a way that it provides things like roads sometimes that we use. It provides basic services that we use, but it does so often very poorly. And higher ed offers a glimpse into kind of a microcosm of a government. There are similar principles at play, including everything from bureaucracy to tax-supported funding for higher ed to procedures that one must go through to get a degree, to one of our favorite things, regulatory components of how higher ed is both administered and run and what it does for those of you that are getting degrees right now. So my argument in 4 steps, basically, we're going to start with 1, that academia is actually a very stable and predictable sector of the economy, and one that's growing for reasons that are very similar to the way that the federal government of the United States operates. It's also very predictable, stable, and growing. And some of the same dynamics are going to come into play. Second, that this stability is a feature of the state's involvement in the higher ed market and state support for higher education. In fact, that's probably one of the driving institutional features of several of the phenomena that I'm going to try and work us through and offer a couple of explanations for. Third, that state support leads to the entrenchment of interest groups. And entrenchment is maintained through features of higher ed such as credentialing and other institutional barriers that also come together and facilitate one of my favorite things to investigate, favorite topics to investigate, and that is the notion of rent-seeking. Who knows what rent-seeking is? So a few of you. I'll give you just a brief kind of layman's definition. This is the utilization of basically state mechanisms, of government mechanisms to distort market exchanges or distort allocations that come out of markets to favored interest groups or persons that generally lobby for it or they try to acquire it through non-transaction means. And the rent that's available there, the rent that's represented, is something that's essentially put out on the table to claim it. It's personally enriching to those people who seek it, but the mechanism of allocation tends to be through structures of government and regulation, and we'll get into some very specific versions of that, so I'll expand on that a little bit as a concept. But my final observation here is that these barriers largely preclude an impending collapse of the higher education system precisely because they are designed to inculcate stability. They're designed to essentially prop up an institution that is sometimes dysfunctional and often even predatory in the way that it operates, but is nonetheless very stable at what it does and has been doing it for many years in a direction that we're going to see. So keep that in mind, and I'll note, pay attention to the term rent-seeking, because this is going to keep coming back up time and time again as we investigate the elements of the higher ed budget. Next thing, I want to set aside what I call the crazy explanations. And this is straight out of the higher ed literature. If you read reporting on the university system, you'll see many of these claims being put forth. Raise your hand again if you've heard this. That the problems of higher ed are attributable to either the corporatization or the commodification of the education system. This is kind of an interesting claim. It has some ostensibly plausible notions behind it. The idea that we are creating degrees as a commodity to shuffle people through this massive system and into the workforce. But it's often not a very robust theory. It's often more like a claim that's thrown out there just for the buzzwords. How many of you have seen the old Team America movie, where Tim Robbins is the puppet, and he's in there, and he gives a speech about the corporations being all bad and corporation-y because they're corporations, and therefore corporations. That's essentially the nature of this argument that we're investigating here. I'm going to set that one aside, but we'll also look at another related term. Who's heard the word neoliberalism brought up? If you read the higher ed literature, there are hundreds upon hundreds of books claiming that the university system has been neoliberalized. What does that mean? Well, we need a definition of the term neoliberalism, which is, I've been searching in vain for that one for about 15 years. Since it first popped up. The best I can give for it is it's something that covers the ideological and economic range of Hillary Clinton's private views, as she expresses to Goldman Sachs, all the way up to Augusto Pinochet on the other end. And there's Donald Trump also falls somewhere in between in there. It's a term that's so widely expansive in its definition, it's lost all meaning. Is what I would argue. So a neoliberal university, if you're telling me that that's the state of the university, I don't really know what you're telling me or critiquing there. It's sometimes juxtaposed to the notion that higher education is a public good, and there are some arguments that are a little more robust behind that we'll investigate, but nonetheless, I want to set aside the neoliberalism talk. Third, higher ed is being shifted toward profits. Who's heard this? Who's been able to find those profits? Is anyone? This is an interesting one. Now, we're going to look at for-profit higher ed, which is a whole different beast unto itself as a subset, but we're talking about traditional four-year public and private colleges and universities, just like San Jose State. Are profits there? Well, I am skeptical of this claim. We'll look at that in a little bit. There's another one that's often attached to that there's conspiracy theories by the Koch brothers that are out there to take over higher ed. All of these fall into the realm of what I call basically the old South Park underpants gnome theories of the higher ed university. And if you've seen that episode, remember it's collect the underpants, profit. There's no direct mechanism that gets us from one of these terms to the other, and some of the terms are so vague that they aren't of much use. Yet, I'd estimate that between 80 and 90% of the higher ed literature out there, the published academic literature, indulges in one or more of those explanations I just used. So they are ubiquitous in the higher ed literature, but I'm going to actually set them aside in favor of something that I prefer as a model or theoretical approach, and that is using cold, hard empirics. So we're going to jump into the perception of academia as a crisis mentality. And that's interesting. It's telling me there's let's see, there we go. That the perception that higher ed is in constant crisis, which is the thrust of most news coverage. But I want to look at academic employment, and we're going to pick that apart, and then we're going to jump into some of the institutions. All of this data that I'm presenting, unless I note specifically otherwise on the chart, comes from the U.S. Department of Higher Education's IPED survey, which is this annual report that they send out to university administrators, and they basically ask them, how many students do you have? How many faculty do you have? What departments exist at your institution? And all sorts of other things. So it's a great data source, but it's almost never deployed in ways that are useful from an institutional perspective compared to some of the literature claims that are here. But I'm going to look at academic employment in particular. And the first one is the state of tenure, because that's often where these discussions start. The notion that tenure is on the decline. Well, it was slightly on the decline, but that was about 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago. And these are the most recent numbers that come out of the IPED survey. The blue line is a depiction of the percentage of full-time faculty at public institutions in the United States. And the red line is at private institutions. And what we see is something happened right around 2003, 2004 that caused both of these lines to stabilize. And they have not altered at any point since then, at least through the most recent data, which is 2014. And this often runs counter to another popular claim that you hear. Who's heard that the financial crisis of 2007, 2008 caused a major disruption in academia? Do you see that disruption anywhere on there? Doesn't seem to appear. What we actually have is a state of tenure where between about 45 and 50% of full-time university faculty are on the tenure track or are in a tenured system of some sort. And doesn't seem to be moving one way or another, at least according to the most recent data. So we're going to set aside that one myth. Let's look at the next thing, though. What about faculty numbers themselves? Faculty growth. This is a depiction of full-time faculty currently employed in the American university system since the early 1970s. And a couple features of it that I'll point out to you very specifically. Notice the last time it declined was 1986, and it was only a very tiny decline that took place. Ever since then, we've had a rapid upward trajectory. And in fact, the trajectory has gotten steeper as we've progressed more into the present day. This is a very vivid depiction of what's going on with faculty hiring because it shows a pattern of growth that has been sustained and sustained across multiple different fields. I'll even show you some of those numbers in a minute to see where your disciplines and your majors break down. But consider this is all faculty at the university system. It tends to be growing. And this caused me to ask the question, is there a way to predict this, or is there some sort of underlying mechanism? And I eventually found it. Eventually found what is explaining it, but it has almost nothing to do with the conventional analysis that's offered of either the adjunctified university or the declining tenure university, the corporate university. Now, I do note that adjuncts have come into greater use in recent years, and some of you may have seen this in a direct witness before. There was a big protest about a year ago where they had a walkout day where a group of adjunct faculty to protest the growth of the dependence on part-time labor. They also called this the Uberification of the academy. Several faculty, walked out and basically said, we need higher salaries, which is another issue in there. But adjunct use has grown. Especially since about the mid-1990s. And if you notice on this chart, it reached near parity about 2011. Whoops. I'll go back. 2011 right there with the number of full-time faculty, although it's declined a little bit since then. And I actually project it to continue to decline for a reason that I'm going to show you in just a moment. And that has something to do with a very specific feature of the higher ed industry. That started around the early 1990s, and that is called for-profit higher ed. How many of you have seen the recent news on for-profit higher ed and know what's going on? Basically, the Obama administration started cracking down on some of the standards of for-profit degrees, and these are things like the University of Phoenix, or the big one that just went bankrupt or just pulled out of the sector was ITT Tech. And some of you may remember Corinthian colleges, some of these other companies that have massive networks of campuses across the country. Well, the interesting feature about them from the faculty side is they employ almost exclusively part-time laborers, adjuncts, in ways that the traditional university system does not. So I started investigating this and asked the question, what happens if we take the for-profit sector out of our numbers for faculty for U.S. higher education? That's what happens. We get a new line. And it started in the early 1990s. And our new line shows adjunct growth has continued, but it actually started to parallel and occur at the same pace as full-time faculty growth if you take the for-profit higher ed sector out of the numbers. In other words, for-profit higher ed was causing a distortion in the red line that made it become increasingly steep after 1994. So what was that distortion? And what specifically played out? Let's take a look at another chart here. This is a chance correlation that I happened upon that seemed to start explaining some of our story here. This is the number of for-profit institutions or campuses in the U.S. university system overlaid with the segment of that previous chart that showed adjunct growth, so the number of adjunct faculty. And if you notice something, they are almost perfectly correlated. And I know these aren't, the scales are intentionally done to show them overlaying, but you see the movements occurring at the same time. So for example, there's a huge jump right here, both in the number of for-profit institutions and the number of part-time adjunct faculty. And then you also see a drop-off in the number of institutions up here, a drop-off in the number of part-time faculty. Well, this is very specific reasons that are playing out. Use 1994 as a starting point. That's when the University of Phoenix went public as a traded firm, and it was kind of the first mover that brought a bunch of other companies behind it. So they started investing in these types of institutions, and then around 2011, we started to see the cracks in the for-profit higher ed sector. We started to see a little bit of evidence of a bubble bursting that continued at that point. And what we can extrapolate from this is that the current state of the adjunct market, including some of the agitation, some of the pushback that's coming out of it about working conditions, is primarily a feature of things that are playing out in the for-profit sector, and a little bit of it spilling over into the traditional higher ed sector. But the other interesting feature of it is that adjunctification, even though it's taken place, has actually paralleled a pretty sustained and continuous growth in almost all sectors of U.S. higher ed. And this is a depiction of the number of faculty by broad fields of higher ed over the past 15, 20 years or so. Actually, I should say I started in 2000, so about 15 years that are covered. And you notice one huge outlier, that's the health sciences. This is the expansion of nursing and pharmacy and degrees of that nature. That's paralleled to the U.S. Medical system's growth. So I kind of consider that a bit of an outlier. But if you look at all these other more traditional academic fields, you see across the board, with a few exceptions, there's been a sustained pattern of growth. One I want to call your attention to is the humanities. That's the blue line right there. And notice the humanities has gone up, even though it's arguably the most afflicted of the different fields by the adjunct problem, as they call it. But it's continued to grow up even after something a little bit more of a robust job market. The social sciences declined a little bit in the early 2010s. Notice fine arts has just exploded in the number of faculty, although this is probably a feature of multiple different types of degree programs. Business schools have grown. Engineering, a slight growth. Education kind of flattened out a little bit in the past 5 to 8 years or so. And then the hard sciences have been pretty stable, which also runs against another narrative we hear all the time about the emphasis on STEM fields and the neglect of all these others. Well, the data don't show that for some reason. Get into some of the explanations, though. Here is the key to it all. And this is the main chart that I want you to remember if you remember nothing else from this particular lecture. The explanation of faculty growth and why faculty are hired at certain rates. Figured this out somewhat by chance, also by suspicion, but I took the number of full-time faculty at traditional not-for-profit institutions of higher education and developed a ratio to the number of enrolled students at those institutions. And what do you notice across the past 35, 40 years as one consistent feature? Right there, 25. We have had a stable ratio that's been maintained in the U.S. university system of about 25 students for every one full-time faculty member for the past 40 years. And it's fluctuated a little bit around that. Some years it's been a little bit above, others a little down. But it's stable. It's probably one of the most remarkably stable features of higher ed. And what this really tells us is that administrators, institutions of higher ed have over many, many decades, figured out and settled upon a rough ratio of how many full-time faculty they need to run a university, how many they need to have a functional university. And this pattern just has not deviated through all the shocks and supposed crisis moments that we've been told about in higher education. It has not deviated. Now, adjunct hiring has occurred in addition to this, but it's mostly supplemental. And you can think about this from your perspective as a student. What do you like about classes and class offerings when you go to sign up? First off, you ask the question, when are they offered? Is it a convenient schedule time for me? Can I take this class on Saturday morning because I have Saturday morning free? Or are Thursday nights more ideal? Second, how big is the class? Is it so big that I'm going to be lost in there and not get any individual attention? Or is it a much smaller, manageable class size where I'm going to get a lot of one-on-one time to discuss with the professor? I'm not going to be a single person in an audience of 500 people. Which type of class would you prefer? Almost invariably the latter. What adjuncts are being used for in the traditional higher ed sector seems to be mostly supplemental because it allows universities to expand the number of course offerings and reduce the number of the classroom size, basically, the number of students per professor. On average. So it spreads across. It's also a better way to utilize classroom space because you can move into other different time areas. So it's a supplemental feature is the argument that I'm making when you consider adjunctification. Now let's jump beyond this though. If the clicker will work. And I am getting a issue here on the computer. I'm going to try to make that go away. There we go. Second feature I want to ask you to consider, though. If we know that faculty hiring is relatively stable and it's chained to issues of student enrollment, it's chained to student enrollment, it's highly responsive to that, what do we know about resources for academia? And in specific, what do we know about the costs of academia? All of you are probably quite attuned to this. How many of you have to deal with student loans, or you know this is going to be a future feature of your payments as you go into the job market? And how has tuition looked in recent years? Who's happy about tuition? All right. We got like one person out of the audience. That's great. But most of you, I assume, are seeing year after year that there are different ways that tuition is either raising, it's going up. How many of you see fees tacked on to tuition, like an athletic support fee or a student activities fee? These are an increasing feature of budgeting. This is all over the place. They're figuring ways to get more and more money out of you, which I want to ask you the question. If the faculty ratio is historically chained to student enrollment numbers, and we know this, and we know that the number of faculty that are hired has paralleled student enrollment numbers, is the university really offering all that much more today than it was in 1995, in 1980, in 1975? Cost has gone up, the price has gone up, but there's some other dynamics at play here. I'll go through some of the literature, the academic literature, but I want to show you some basic numbers here first. This blue line's interesting because it shows direct federal and state appropriations to the U.S. higher education system over the past a little less than 10 years or so. So I started in the mid-2000s to get before the financial crisis and ran it up to the most recent numbers, which unfortunately is 2012, but that's the best that we have at the moment. And we show there's been a pretty precipitous rise that continued past the financial crisis. Then it stabilized a little bit. It dropped off. These are all inflation adjusted, so you can compare directly dollar to dollar. The second line, though, that is the amount of money that's coming in from your tuition payments to the university system. So resources derived from tuition have gone up dramatically in uninterrupted fashion. If you think about this, it's also tied to tuition itself going up. So what are the reasons, or what's going on here? Well, here's a depiction of a way that I want to frame it as essentially the balance sheet of higher ed plus some accoutrements. Balance sheet of higher ed is the direct operating expenditures of the U.S. university system. 2013, our most recent numbers. Between public, private, and for-profit institutions, they spent $500 billion just to operate year to year. This doesn't include multi-year issues and extensions and industries that are connected to higher ed, in some ways on the operating side, in other ways on other features of higher ed. So one I'll point out, if you want to take a guess of how many student loans are currently outstanding according to the most recent numbers, $1.2 trillion of currently outstanding student loans that will have to be repaid at some point, at least according to our basic claims about the financial system. Second, we know also that there are several industries that are connected to the operation of higher ed. They have expenses tied to them. They also have some sources of income, higher ed publishing industry, the people that put out books and journals and all the things that are connected to publishing research. There are educational support industries. This is like classroom products, everything from technology down to software features like those horrendous online interaction software packages that they make you and they make faculty use. Those are always great. They seem to, one of my friend jokes that they seem to be designed by someone who has a vague conception that he or she thinks he knows how the internet works, but has never actually used the internet. But nonetheless, there's a huge industry in that. There's contracts. You have SAT prep, GRE prep, all these different things that you've probably encountered at some point in your career. Then you also have university-connected activities, sponsored research, sports, university sports, government contracts, private sector contracts, a lot of money tied up in higher ed. One of the things I want to convey to you by this point is that higher ed is a multi-trillion-dollar beast of an industry. Massive industry that has huge appropriations wrapped up in it, both public and private, and they are running throughout our consideration. That means there's a lot of money on the table, and a lot of money on the table means there are a lot of rents to be sought, a lot of rents to be extracted. When the government and private sector entities put money on the table to be allocated, and the allocation mechanism is political, what do you think people do? Interest groups emerge and they seek them out, and some of them gain them for reasons of successful lobbying strategies internal to the university system and external at, say, like the state legislature. Well, I want to run through a brief theory that kind of lays out why our education system permits the rent-seeking society to basically take hold in it. And this derives from a book that was written in 1970 by James Buchanan, later won the Nobel Prize, a very distinguished economist, called Academia and Anarchy. And he laid out a very fascinating depiction of the marketplace that exists in higher ed. And he said there are three features of this marketplace. The first one, we have a market of consumers who do not directly pay for their product. Who are those consumers? Someone shouted out. Students. How do you pay for your product? Tuition, but it's almost always through a roundabout system. It's always through either the loan system, or maybe you have a fellowship or a scholarship or grant. Even if you are paying tuition directly, some of the expenses, at least as they call it, are passed through indirect mechanisms, so fees that are tacked on. There's very little price responsiveness in a direct mechanism that's available to you. You see your tuition going up, or you see your loan payments once you've graduated. You see how that's stretched out over many years or even decades. But there's not really a price tag. You don't walk into the classroom and say, hey, well, this class costs $7,000. And this other class that I took across the hall cost $5,000. There's no mechanism at play like that. It's all standardized, and it's all passed through a second or third party dealer of the university system. And what Buchanan points out is that this process has a severe toll on the signals that prices normally send when we engage in transactions. So when you go to the grocery store and you purchase something, you're very price conscious and responsive to the price tag that's there on the product. Higher ed, not so much. All these distortion mechanisms come into play, so they obscure to the point that you don't fully know quite how much you're paying at the exact moment, or really what the product is you're getting. So there's kind of a dampening effect that plays out. That's Buchanan's first point. He says, so we have consumers that don't directly pay for their product. Second, we have producers that do not directly sell their products. Who are the producers in higher ed? The teachers, the faculty. And this is an old problem of higher ed. Adam Smith pointed this out in 1776. That's how long this has been known. He was writing about, he taught at the University of Edinburgh and at Oxford. over in England. And he compared his experiences between these two institutions. And he noted that the Scottish universities, where he kind of grew up in, had a system where students were allowed to pay extra or reward their lecturers that they liked, the effective teachers, the good teachers, because there was a direct payment mechanism. But then when he went down to Oxford, he noticed that the system was not in place. Rather, it was run through what existed as a university bureaucracy at the time, and all the payment mechanisms were indirect. So we asked the question about what does this do to the quality of the professors? And what do you think happened? Who do you think had the better professors, at least in Smith's mind? Edinburgh or Oxford? Edinburgh. Why? There's a mechanism at play to incentivize and reward good teachers and also send signals about them, the popular teachers, the better lecturers. Well, higher ed has unfortunately trended more and more toward the Oxford model ever since then. And basically what we have today is that faculty that are not either rewarded or penalized by the quality of the product that they deliver. And that also includes the types of classes that they offer. So Buchanan says faculty tend to be utility maximizers. They're self-interested. They want to teach about what they research. They want to do things they like, and we can't blame them for that. But what it means is what faculty like to do doesn't always align with what educators seek as the mission of the university or a proper degree program in a given field. And Buchanan considers all the different elements of this as they come together, and what it basically means is utility maximizing faculty respond to a very different set of incentive structures than a market incentive. Third complication. Remember, we got consumers that don't directly pay, producers that don't directly sell, and we have owners of the university who do not directly control their product. Who owns the university? The people? The state of California? Boards of trustees? There are all sorts of institutional arrangements, but about the best you can get in terms of engagement is either a politically appointed figure or a philanthropic person from the private sector who's been recruited to sit on a board and direct the trajectory and strategy of a university. Now, a lot of these people are appointed to honorary positions. It's considered something that you do if you're of a certain stature in society. So they pull people out of private sector companies, or they pull major political figures in and say, go serve on the board of this university. You direct the place. How often do you think those boards meet? Very, very few. Sometimes they'll have meetings once a month where a more permanent figure will basically phone it in for the rest. Oftentimes, trustees do not attend these meetings. Sometimes it gets scaled back to as infrequent as once a year. What Buchanan predicts of this is says it's going to disincentivize board engagement in the product that they technically owned. So you have consumers who are astray, producers who are astray, and owners who are astray. So what the hell does the university respond to in terms of incentives or signals about what it should be doing or what it should be offering to the public? And Buchanan says this is the great mystery. The cumulative effects of all of our feedback signals are generally absent. So there's no mechanism of exit or departure if the university product turns crappy. There's no mechanism of signaling approval or consumption if a certain sector of the university is offering something that's great or desirable. Rather, people turn to other types of incentives, and they turn to other types of measures, including contrived measures such as our favorite, standardized testing. How many of you remember that from lower ed and have seen it creeping over into higher ed? Well, this is a substitute mechanism supposedly for quality of a university system in lieu of a price mechanism to send signals on what we need to do to change our strategy. What's a poor signal on top of that? And there's a confused and muddled signal that's coming out of our traditional market mechanisms. Buchanan says this is basically going to create opportunities for our favorite term, rent-seeking, rent extraction of all the resources that are devoted to higher ed. Which leads me to my own attempt to summarize the different components of higher ed. This is something I call the growth cycle of the university system. And I mean growth cycle as a historian going back 200 years to see this process play out. Step one, the state becomes involved in higher education. There's a vast literature on this. An economist by the name of E.G. West discussed this intrusion process, mainly looking at lower ed, so K through 12, and its equivalents in Great Britain. But what he noticed is as government becomes increasingly involved in the provision of education, it distorts and alters the type of education that's being offered. In other words, the institution itself responds to the government money and incentives that are provided by it. What this does is it means governments capture the provision of education normally from private entities. So historically they were churches or private institutions that were set up on a board of trustee that would create a university. Well, if the government steps in, it alters the trajectory of the original mission and often co-opts the curriculum, distorts the curriculum. And finally, West says, and notices this quite prominently, government involvement in higher education also tends to crowd out other institutions that are privately offering education. And we see this historically in the U.S. university system. As government funding for education increased, the government itself began to buy previously private universities and institutions and saved many of them from bankruptcy in some ways. But it's also a crowding out effect that's really playing out there. Second feature. As government becomes involved, the rents that are available for disbursement increase, and a way to maintain control of the rents that are available from higher education is to erect entry barriers and rationing devices that allow access to them to certain people that are connected either politically into the university system to receive them or are capable of lobbying for those resources. This goes back to George Stigler's basic theory of regulatory capture, which he says, basically the first feature we see of regulatory capture taking place, the big show, the giveaway that a public regulation has become co-opted by someone in a private or selective interest group, is the fact that they come in and they establish entry barriers. Well, what is higher education if not a massive indulgence in entry barriers? And I point out two in particular. One is going to be very familiar to you, and that is the degree. What is a degree? It's a piece of paper, a union card, if you will, that allows you to go out into the workforce and get a certain type of job, either connected to that degree. If you want to be a doctor, you need a medical degree. If you want to be a lawyer, you need a law degree. If you want to work in most professional job programs that are out there, you need at least a bachelor's degree, and oftentimes a bachelor's degree in a specific area that's related to that job. So there's one credential. So there's a barrier to the product that's being offered. The second, and this is something on the structural side of the university, is what we refer to as the accreditation process. Higher ed is accredited through a system of ostensibly private entities, private organizations that every university belongs to, and they tend to be sorted regionally or by the type of school. But an accreditation agency basically says that San Jose State is meeting all the curricular requirements to offer an economics degree that are standard for the field, and therefore we approve San Jose State to issue an economics degree and an engineering degree and an English degree and so forth. So these private agencies are basically a stamp that a university is up to snuff. It's able to perform the task that it's claiming to perform. It becomes an entry barrier, though, because it has one very specific provision in law that's connected to it. How do you get state and federal funding if you're a university? In order to qualify, you have to be accredited. And this is written into most of the federal statutes and state statutes that have copied. So to have access to all these massive amounts of resources, to be eligible to receive subsidized federal and state student loans, you have to be accredited generally. Very, very few exceptions, but that's roughly the rule. There's a little bit of literature on this, on how both of these things work together as entry barriers, both in the product to the job market and the accreditation to the type of university itself. So I could not go up and say, I'm going to create the University of Phil Magness tomorrow and start issuing degrees. They wouldn't be recognized as accredited, and then I couldn't take money, and I might even subject myself to prosecution for offering a degree that's outside of the accreditation system in certain states. This gives rise to our third feature, the budget maximizing bureaucrat. And if you know anything about bureaucracy, these types of creatures exist all over the place. Although they are, there's a bit of a divided literature. The one thing I want to cite to you, though, is the original theory. This was put together by an economist by the name of Bill Niskanen. And he basically said that bureaucrats also tend to be utility maximizers. They also tend to be in it for themselves. So one of their strategies in a bureaucratic system is to increase all the perks of their own offices, to buy a new cappuccino machine, to install fancy new desks and skylights, to pay for themselves to go on work retreat conferences to Las Vegas. All the stuff that we see normally associated with, say, like the IRS or some public scandal at a major institution. Well, the interesting thing about higher ed, though, is it also operates very similarly to the Niskanen model, although there are some contested claimants that put forth other variations of the Niskanen model in the traditional bureaucracy. Well, there's been one test that actually confirmed a slightly modified Niskanen theory scenario played out almost to the T, fit the model, all the data played out exactly as he predicted if you modified these 2 or 3 minor assumptions. Anyone want to take a guess of what sector that was in? California State Community College System. Budget maximizing bureaucrats were abundant there in this particular study. So, as the bureaucrats move in, they also find functions of their offices tied to specific elements of funding. And this is where state involvement in funding higher ed starts to ask for things in return. If the government invests in something in major ways, they want to get results, ostensibly. And those results often come with regulatory stipulations or expectations that are tied to them. So you get regulatory mandates as our next feature. They tend to increase historically in a pattern that parallels state funding. Most famous that you have probably all encountered is the Title IX segment of the Higher Education Act, which almost everything in higher ed is tied to compliance with Title IX, that has all sorts of rules and regulations from the federal level that any recipient college or university has to follow. And how do you think rules are administered? Are they costless? No. You have to hire bureaucrats to administer them. And bureaucrats also tend to find other bureaucrats to divide the work amongst. And they do so in ways that also are coupled frequently with calls for increased funding for their bureaucracy in order to meet the federal mandates. So it's kind of a vicious cycle playing off of each other. As funding increases and as mandates increase tied to that funding, bureaucrats are needed to carry out those mandates. And as bureaucrats come in, they lobby for more bureaucrats to assist in carrying out increasingly onerous mandates. So this is a feature that's really played out, we see in some of the evidence I'm going to show you. And all of this comes together, creates a scenario where rent-seeking ensues. 3 features of it. Low-level administrators tend to become the dominant player in this scenario. So not university presidents, but like the guy that runs the student services offices, or the campus dorms, or even the dining hall comes under some of this. But you also see other features that emerge. You also find certain faculty become very adept at lobbying their own institutions to devote resources to pet projects. You get a lot of weaker programs and disciplines come under what I call a faculty resource gobbler. These are so you imagine like the Department of 17th Century French Poetry that graduates 2 students every decade, but nonetheless has 6 people on faculty and classes that are attended by 8 students in a given semester. That's an extreme scenario that I make up, but you see examples of this all over higher ed. So degrees that really don't have an intake of students that nonetheless persist much longer than you'd expect if there were a market mechanism at play. And then finally, our old friend, the for-profit higher ed industry, jumps back in. How do you think for-profits work? How do they get money? So they're accredited. Until very recently, at least, that was clamped down upon. For-profit institutions like the University of Phoenix and all the way down ITT Tech have or had accreditation. What does this give them access to? Student loans, federal money. How do you increase the amount of federal money that you're getting? If you are a full private sector for-profit institution. Well, you take on more students. You have an incentive to sign up as many students as possible for FAFSA forms and student loans that come out of that. So we have case after case after case of some of the more unscrupulous higher ed for-profit practitioners basically setting up offices that shuffle people through the student loan bureaucracy, filling out the forms, give them supposedly an education. Oftentimes it's a more marginal education than you get at traditional colleges. Not always, but sometimes, especially the worst practitioners. They hand them a degree after 4 or 5 years, and then year 6, what happens? Loan collectors start coming. But they're long gone from the university that shuffled them through the student loan process to begin with. It's no longer their concern if you're a for-profit higher ed corporation. Rather, it's saddling the student with debt and arguably a junk degree many years after he or she has left that institution, strictly through the federal student loan program. And they're able to do this because they have deployed economies of scale connected to their own internal administration to helping people figure out student loan processes and programs. This is where we get anecdotal but true examples of certain unnamed for-profit higher ed companies that were found walking through public parks in San Francisco and recruiting homeless people to sign up and fill out their FAFSA form, and saddling them many years later with tens of thousands of dollars in debt. I cannot think of a more immoral or horrendous way to take advantage of someone in a vulnerable position than that. But nonetheless, we have recorded instances of it happening. This is all made available because there are rents on the table to be claimed by the fact that money has been thrown into higher ed. So, what does the educrat bureaucracy do and get out of it? Here's a depiction of the educat bureaucracy so I can prove to you that it has absolutely exploded. And I want you to pay attention first to the blue line. That's university presidents, vice presidents, provosts, high-level, top-level administrators. They have grown somewhat, including especially since the early 2000s. They started to expand a little bit faster than they were going historically. The red line is the familiar one you all know. We saw it before. That's the full-time faculty. But the real story that almost nobody is talking about because they're all focused on administrative bloat at the top end is administrative bloat at the lower end. That's the gray line. And what do you see going on there? You've had low-level, routine, day-to-day, non-managerial bureaucrats, or educrats, as I like to call them, starting out in 1976, a little under 200,000. Today, they've topped, what are we at, 800,000 currently employed in the U.S. university system. There are more educrats employed in the U.S. university system than full-time faculty members. This is unparalleled in history. It crossed about 6 or 7 years ago, but the trajectory has been upward. So I argue that the real story of administrative bloat, in other words, where a lot of this money is going to, where your tuition dollars that are increasing are going, happens to be represented in that gray line. And it's grown in exponential ways. Here to bring it home to you as students. This is the ratio, historically, of low-level educrat administrators to students. 1976, there were 60 students per educrat in the U.S. university system. Today, it's less than 25 to 1. So they've met and surpassed the faculty level. We also see the growth rates. And you notice here's high-level administrators as well as faculty and students. They've all hovered between just a little under or a little over 2% annual growth rate. What about the educrats? 4.6% average annual growth rate historically. Massive. That's where all the money is going. So I'm going to offer you a theory of it. What are the sources of administrative bloat at the lower levels? 1, regulatory compliance, what we already talked about. The fact that mandates are coming down from above means more people are needed and are hired to enforce those mandates. And they're coming both from stricter accreditation demands and direct regulatory mandates from the Department of Education and other state education agencies to operate a university. That justifies more budgets to be allocated for basically filling out paperwork or complying with the standards that are expected that come with government funding. So that's there. Second one, though, I call internal rent-seeking to the university for ideological causes and political causes. We've seen a massive explosion over the past 20 years of this type of activity. Things that were not in existence in 1990 or 1980 or were very rare. One of the ones I often point out to is the Office of Sustainability. Almost every campus in America has one of these now. and they aim to make the campus carbon neutral or something, or put 17 different recycling bins in every office. Nonetheless, whether you agree with that or not, it's there, and it's gained greater amounts of funding through the administrative functions of the academy. Here's an example I'll show you here, a personal story. This is sitting out on the plaza in front of my office building at GMU back in Arlington, Virginia. It's a solar-powered picnic table. In other words, the solar panels on the roof of the picnic table collect sunlight and convert it into plugs that you can stick your phone or your laptop in, and a giant battery pack at the bottom. I've sat at this table, had lunch at it before, tried to use it. It's often depleted because it's not always the sunniest place to eat lunch in Fairfax, Virginia, or it's also not all that efficient. It's often broken. Anyone want to take a guess of how much these things cost? I think the budget we found, they were about 11 grand a piece to install. 11 grand a piece. I asked the question, why couldn't you get a $200 picnic table and run an extension cord to it from the building right next door? But nonetheless, 11 grand a piece, and they installed dozens of these things. And you see it at universities all over the place. I'm sure the person whose job it was to install this did a perfectly fine completion of that job. But I asked the question, where is that money coming from? What's coming from your tuition and your student fees from this massive office that has grown exponentially over the years and gained more and more resources as a permanent fixture of the university. We also see it, so campus diversity offices are another one. There may be a perfectly good function to have diversity personnel associated with a campus activity, but the question is, how do we divert resources to it? If you look at some of the student protest movements that have emerged over the last year, read some of the lists of demands. You start to see several of these types of offices, administrators who have kind of put the bug in the students' ears that, hey, as long as you're protesting, you might as well request another $10,000 for the library annex of my little office that I want here. We need a green library that has sustainability literature in it. And you see examples like that throughout. It's taking place all over. There's a resource allocation that's coming through explicit lobbying for these types of political causes. Again, we can ask a question fairly. Should we invest in those things? But nonetheless, it's there. Third feature, jobs programs for other educrats. In other words, people who go to college and refuse to leave. And not refuse to leave by never getting the degree, but refuse to leave, but they get a degree that's very marginal, doesn't have many skills in the way of employability, oftentimes is directly connected to higher ed administration itself. There are entire degree programs. If you want to become a dorm manager for life, if you really like your RA or your RA job and you want to do that trajectory, you can get a degree in dorm management. And these type of people basically migrate from one university to the next in administrative roles. So there's a fulfillment in that's driving some of it. There's a creation from the degree side that's pushing it. And then finally, we have this is really my favorite, student prospecting. Why do we have educrats? Well, universities are investing in educrat institutions and establishments because they use it as a mechanism, a marketing mechanism to pull in more students. Favorite trend that's going on around the country right now, there are universities that are installing lazy river complexes. Anyone know what these are? Yeah, if you've been to a water park, you know you have the lazy river where you sit in the tube and you float around in a circle. Louisiana State, Texas Tech, 3 or 4 others have built these on campus in the past few years. These cost a lot of money. Millions upon millions of dollars to build a lazy river on campus. And not only that, once you've built the lazy river, you have to staff the thing. You got to hire lifeguards all the way up to aquatics administrators to run the things. Now, they're popular rock climbing walls. There's one at the University of Missouri. I think they built the rock climbing wall, and they brought in some artistic designer who supposedly made the rocks look like the landscape of the state of Missouri somehow. So it raised the price tag on this to multiple millions of dollars. This type of stuff is all over the place. Why are administrators keen to fund this type of thing? Because it's selling the lifestyle of being a college student. It means when you go to visit Campus X versus my campus that has a lazy river, a rock climbing wall, and student concerts every weekend and all these fun activities on the side, which one are you going to choose? The one that has all the features. I mean, who doesn't want to sit in a tube and drink a beer floating around all day in a lazy river? Sounds like a great life. I'd like to study for exams that way. But if you want to consider it, these things cost money, and resources are devoted and allocated to it in ways that pass the price tag on to somebody else. So who does it pass the price tag on to? You, me, taxpayers, the public. So I ask as an ethical question, is it fair that we devote resources to all of these different aspects of administration? Maybe. Maybe. There are probably some cases that we'd have to consider on an office-by-office basis. You could not give up accreditation, or else the entire university system would fall apart. So obviously some money has to be devoted to accreditors. Rock climbing walls and lazy rivers, on the other hand, it's a fair question to ask. What we see, though, and one of the points I want to stress to you is regardless of whether we like it or not, many of these mechanisms of administrative funding are the products of concentrated interest within the university explicitly lobbying, hey, fund my office, or fund my project, or fund my new building, as opposed to a broader interest that would encapsulate you as students, or you as taxpayers, or you as faculty at large for the institution, because those are the people that are going to be paying the dispersed costs. In other words, when they tack on a $100 student activity fee that funds a single office that offers a product that is very unevenly consumed across campus, that maybe only serves a small sector of the student community, that's a resource reallocation from you to that particular office. So we have to ask the question ethically, is this fair? Is this right? Especially if it means rising tuition across the board for all of you. So, whenever you see an administrator proposing something new for campus, ask the question, is it fair to raise tuition on all students so we can fund more college sports, so we can create new administrative offices and pay higher administrative salaries, so we can sustain unpopular degree programs and departments, so we can promote ideological causes, so we can build rock climbing walls and lazy rivers? Any of these things across campus have implications of an ethical nature because the cost has to be paid by somebody, and more often than not, and that's the student. We add politicization into this, and this is where things get a little controversial, but I am going to make a point to you, regardless of whether you come at it from the left or the right or somewhere else entirely, the academy does have very politicized elements, and we can empirically demonstrate this, including right here. Whoops. That's a preview of what's to come. This is from the Higher Ed Research Institute at UCLA's. They've done a semi-annual survey of university faculty to ask them of political perspectives. And, historically, the academy has tended to lean left of center. Just for many, many decades, it's generally acknowledged, and whether you are left of center or not, that's just a feature, an empirical feature of the academy. But a really interesting trend has emerged, and this is from a study by Sam Abrams, as a faculty that's researched into this, political scientist. And he noticed, using the Higher Ed Research Institute data, unfortunately it doesn't have room for libertarians or communists or whatever in there, so it's only left and right, but he noticed that there was a very strange pattern that emerged in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where the concentration of left and far left faculty started to rapidly increase, and the concentration of moderate faculty went on a slight decline, as did conservative faculty. And he's asking the question, what's really going on here? What's driving this? And one of the answers he offers is he thinks it's tied to some of the institutional characteristics that I've just brought up, including administrative bloat, but also the allocation of resources, and the way that certain disciplines are emphasized and taught. One other feature I add to it, the ideological split seems to be most pronounced in the humanities, which is probably not a big surprise to anyone. I come from a humanities background, and I'm not afraid to admit this. It does tend to harbor all sorts of ideological causes, including many that I disagree with, but nonetheless are there. So here's some other empirics, something I like to call Marxiness in the academy. started studying some of the humanities and other disciplines to see where the ideological tilt is. And note that I'm not saying that it's wrong to study Karl Marx in the academy. Rather, you should. Anyone should. He's a major figure in history, one that I disagree with on many levels, but I view as a component of an educated society, someone that you should at least be aware of what his basic arguments are. What I'm focusing on here, though, is the representation of Marxianus across the academy. Here's some stats I'll give you. First, Karl Marx is the second most assigned author in U.S. academia, after the Strunk & White Grammar Manual. So you think about that. So it's really first place if you set aside all the technical manual on how to write a term paper. Second most assigned author in academia. Second, he is assigned at 2 times the average frequency of any other major thinker in the Western intellectual canon, except for one, and that's Plato. Plato falls in just slightly behind Marx, but then it's a drop-off. So you go from Marx is on like 3,000 syllabi, John Locke will be on 1,400, Adam Smith will be on 1,200. It's a massive, massive concentration around the teaching of Marx. Third feature of this, Marx is actually not commonly taught in his home discipline of economics. Which is kind of interesting. Less than 3% of syllabi where Marx is an assigned feature of the reading are in economics departments, and most of those are history of economic thought classes, where he has a role. He's a part of the curriculum for a reason, but very, very small percentage in econ. In other words, economics has largely rejected Marxist thought. But where is it Harvard? These are all disciplines that use Marx at a higher rate or higher frequency on their syllabi than economics. The humanities, history, English, sociology, philosophy, and then you get to some of the smaller humanities. It trails off from there, but all have very high Marx concentrations in comparison to some of the social sciences like economics or even political science. He's not nearly as popular. Which I find this is kind of interesting that even though he has relevant connections to each of these fields, both as a figure and as a theoretical contributor, I don't think he's the single most important person in the history of intellectual thought levels of importance. So we can set that aside. We ask the question, so why is Marx emphasized? I think it's a good indicator of an ideological tilt. And all this comes from stats I pulled from the Open Syllabus Project, which aggregates syllabi and who's taught. I argue this is a problem because it also becomes a captive part of the institutional arrangement of higher ed, including something I call the mandatory general ed courses, which has been a shift in humanities thinking since about the 1970s, early 1970s or so. Humanities used to be very concentrated and topic-specific. There's been a shift in humanities teaching practices away from that, even though those types of courses still exist, toward general ed requirements, fulfillment of classes that you have to take before you even declare a major. Most common one of this is Composition 101. How many of you have taken some sort of writing or composition class? That's the entire room, basically. Well, we have actual stats on this, and this is why I use it. Between 1973 and 1998, they looked at the growth of mandatory Composition 101, and they saw that it had basically doubled in size in the number of courses you have to take, and had grown from maybe about a little over 3/4 of the academy required it to nearly 100% today. And the result is that 95% plus of all U.S. college students have to teach some sort of, or take some sort of general ed composition type class, compared to less than 40% for all these other disciplines: economics, math, STEM classes, poli-sci, government, things that are outside of the traditional humanities core. So I actually think there's some sort of mechanism at play that the ideological tilt of the humanities is connected also to the shift in the teaching focus of the humanities that's played out. And I don't fully know the mechanism there. It's something I'm investigating, though, and it also tends to be drawn or connected to a distinctive problem of the humanities, and that's a job market glut. I'll show you these two graphs real quickly just to give you an idea. These are the number of Ph.D.s, new Ph.D.s generated each year in the humanities by discipline. The red are what we call MLA, so English plus foreign languages, literature. Blue is history. my own background field. Then you got it trails off from there. So gray is philosophy and so forth. But you see a massive continuing upward trajectory in most of these fields with a little bits of dips, but it's generally the pathway is up. Now contrast that. Here are the number of job postings in those same fields. They're all heading down. So sorry if any of you are philosophy majors. You're facing probably a very tough job market. What does this mean? Well, and it's interesting because even though we see individual job postings are going downward, faculty hiring has remained stable, at least in the humanities at large. It's just there are many more people seeking these jobs than actual jobs exist consistently. So what I call the humanities outlier, which tends to be the focus of higher ed criticism, is something that looks at a disparity between Ph.D. production and demand for faculty. I basically argue that degree overproduction has led to certain types of rent-seeking endemic to internally to certain humanities disciplines to hire and soak up and compensate for that glut, to basically give their own majors and PhDs in particular jobs, which what happens if you start throwing money at something? You start attracting new people to it, so they've only increased the number of PhD seekers for many of these fields. Yeah, so the student population specific. Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, absolutely, is a generally educated person. Yeah. Right, right. Okay, okay. So everyone say, yeah. There's an interesting, I guess a mechanism at play here. The question, for those that didn't hear it, the market demand for getting a degree. If I'm reading you right, getting a degree in say one of the humanities. Yeah. In some ways, but it's also a distorted demand for that. You actually see declining number of undergrad majors in most humanities. This has been a pattern for about 20 years that there are fewer majors today than there were in the early 1990s in most of these fields. But you've seen from that first chart, as we saw, the number of PhDs that is issued has gone up. So what do I think is going on here? I don't have a full explanation without further investigation of the phenomenon, but I actually do think that PhD emphasis or PhD training emphasis or the allocation of money to granting new PhDs is a good way to sustain and continue and expand a department or a program. And when you start offering funding, so one of the things about PhD programs, most of them tend to be internally funded through the department, so they pay your tuition to go there. If you're offering more and more PhDs as a way of expanding your own institutional presence, you're going to attract students eventually. You're basically giving away a degree or giving away a subsidy for that particular degree. So I do know a little bit of some of the numbers of that we have seen expanded funding for PhDs. That gets into that type of the question. One thing I do want to note is that there's a parallel intellectual content shift that seems to have accompanied the teaching focus on general ed. One thing I'll note, there's a bit of a bootleggers Baptist effect. Those of you that studied the political economy of bootleggers Baptist basically says that there's a good reason and a bad reason associated with funding something. So what's the good reason for, let's say, requiring everyone to take Composition 101? Students are terrible writers, and all other professors complain about it, right? So we need to fix that. What would be a bad reason, though? Well, I'd like to expand my department's presence, and I want to hire more faculty, and I'm the department chair. So there's a little bit of a flip side of this playing out. And you can make analogous claims about other types of departments as well, which also tends to prop up degree programs that tend to be in decline in the number of majors that are seeking them. One more feature. Yeah. So, and I'll wrap this up on our final component. This is the academic credential. And the academic credential specifically tied to institutional barriers. So I've already talked a bit about accreditation. Here's how it works and kind of comes in conjunction and becomes a mechanism for rent allocation. Brief history of accreditation is it was privately set up in the early to mid 1800s as coalitions or organizations of colleges that were designed to standardize and review privately institutional curricula. As the federal government increasingly became a funder of education, this started in the Land Grant Act of 1862, federal government itself also started to put pressure on accreditors to validate the legitimacy of a degree or to make sure that the degree was worth expending tax money on. It's a perfectly valid concern that you'd have if you were a federal government official and you wanted to make sure money was being spent well. After the GI Bill, they discovered a bit of a problem. There was an emergence when the GI Bill started funding troops that came home from World War II to go to college. All these institutions that we call degree mills started popping up and say, hey, well, we'll take your money to go to college. And it'd be like run out of a motel in rural Montana, mailing out paper copies of a degree to a soldier who turned around and paid federal funds for a very substandard, if non-existent, education. So the federal government really started cracking down on that. One of the things that they wrote into the Higher Education Act of 1965 was that to be qualified for federal funding of any type, in most circumstances, you had to be accredited as an institution by something that was approved by CHIA, or the Council of Higher Education Accreditors, which is the supervisory body for all these entities. And what CHIA did, is created this access point to federal money. Federal dollars come from accreditation. Private accrediting bodies effectively become public regulators through this co-option process, and they use regulatory implementation as a means of enforcing accreditation and vice versa. So why does credentialing persist? Trump University was not accredited, but why does credentialing persist? Well, it sets up a variety of institutional structures that all play into this rent disbursement. First and foremost, accreditation is the access point to money. And this is why we see the rise and the decline of the for-profit industry has been directly tied to initially lax federal regulations for for-profit accreditors, have shifted into very strict, increasingly strict regulations for for-profit accreditors, to the point that the Department of Education has recently revoked a number of them. What does that do? It changes the access point to money. Access to government money is specifically tied not only to obtaining a credential, but to obtaining loans. And we've really found evidences of fraud and substandard problems that emerge from the for-profit sector in this allocation. One study that came out of Brookings in 2015 said that 70% of loans currently in default were from for-profit companies that we're authoring. So that's huge. It's a massive amount. What else does accreditation do or deliver in terms of access points to money? It's not simply money for higher ed, it's money for future employment and jobs. I estimate at the current moment there are about 30 million people on federal, state, or local government payrolls directly, and another roughly 10 million that are contractors that work for governments. How do you get promoted? How do you get access points to many government jobs? You have a degree. You have a college degree that meets the checkbox on the formulaic structure of promotion. If you work for the federal government, you're on the GS system, and you bump up from GS 4 to 5 to 6 to 7 based on the types of degrees and credentials you obtain. You can move up the ladder physically by getting a college degree, and sometimes they'll even pay for you to do it. So what does this mean? This is a huge sector of the employment market. And you think about this, public school teachers, they have to have a degree. Attorneys that work in the criminal justice system have to have a degree in order to qualify to even have access to those points of jobs. What does this mean? Is that the federal government's own operation and activities and hiring practices and payment practices are directly sustaining and tied to and stabilizing of the higher education system. So that's why credentialing persists, which gives us our concluding point. Briefly, what we've already established, let's go over. Our faculty hiring isn't actually declining. We've got the stable ratio that's pretty fixed. We know across history. State funding also tends to be pretty stable, and jobs in the academic sector are actually growing. Second, and I'll add to this, higher ed isn't fully selling knowledge, even though we like to claim as a lofty goal that that's what we're doing. It's actually engaged in the selling of credential. If Brian Kaplan's theory, which is a forthcoming book, holds true, that higher ed is this access point, it's the union card to getting a job. And then finally, we see mechanisms throughout the economy that higher ed is deeply, deeply entrenched in everything that we do in terms of a job industry, in terms of its own industry. It's a multi-trillion-dollar feature that has public support, and it's connected to accreditation. So what does this mean? Is as long as government workers are around, degrees will tend to persist, even if the private sector were, for whatever reason, to completely abandon higher education, degrees would still persist. I'm going to note or conclude on that thought and just run to questions to give you time to give some feedback. And any thoughts that you have. As I said, this is an ongoing, developing, forthcoming project. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have on it or take any ideas that you may have on further avenues to develop. So thank you.
We have microphones for the questions. You have to turn the switch.
First, I always ask questions, always challenge everyone. So first, thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. It was very fascinating. So the difficult question: higher education generally is a captive market. You'd probably agree with that statement. What is the outcome that you think that we should be pushing for? What outcome are you pushing for directional change? Because that's I'm not sure where you would say we need to take this.
Yeah, I don't have a magic bullet, and I don't think there really is a magic bullet for fixing the problems with higher ed. I argue that higher ed has many problems, as you've seen. We've gone through several of them, but there are no pools of money out there to fix budget shortfalls or relieve tuition. Some things that we'd have to do, I'd argue, would have to be pursued on the margin. So, for example, maybe when you see an administrator proposing a very niche, focused little new office to create something, ask the question: is this money going to be coming out of my tuition? Is this money going to be a new fee that's created for me? To start being more scrutinizing when the administrative components of the university system are seeking to expand themselves. So that's one way to do it. And the other may be taking it to the taxpayers, taking it to the public, taking a case specifically that the ethical obligation of the taxpayer, if they are going to fund higher education, should actually be funding activities that are tied to students as opposed to ideological causes of faculty or growth in administrative positions to run a new rec center or campus lazy river or pool, that kind of thing. So a little bit of budget scrutiny, I think, could go a long way. I don't have a magic fix, but I'd be welcome to entertain any ideas or proposals.
So you mentioned Kaplan's theory that colleges aren't selling knowledge; they're selling the union card.
Yeah.
So do you believe that degrees are still an effective labor market signal? And if not, is there a better alternative for a better labor market signal?
And this comes into, you see some of the private sector tech firms and stuff are just starting to do like software programming credentialing online or separate from their firms. These are niche skills, which I think is very fundamental. But if you ask yourself, we have a historical precedent of this. Does anyone ever read about or remember or maybe even taken a correspondence course? These were things that used to be offered by the mail, and they were issue-specific or topic-specific certifications. These go back over 100 years that they've been doing it. They've just become more technologically savvy. What does the market signal of the degree happen to do? I think there's going to be a divergence that's emerging in what degrees mean, and this could be on the lines of majors. It could be on the types of institutions that degrees come from. For example, right now, an economics degree tends to enter one into a relatively healthy job market, both on the high end as a Ph.D. There's a near 98, 99% placement rate of Ph.D.s that come out with economics. Lower level undergrad degrees in economics, for example, tend to have a higher market value because it normally signals a competence in other types of skills. So it says you can do math, for example. Or you have a certain structured way of thinking that is built around trade-offs and recognizing the features of those when you're making a decision in the firm. The downside is it also turns the degree in 17th century French poetry into more of a consumption good. And that's where I think that you start seeing some of the trailing off in the Kaplan model.
Again, thank you for coming. Amazing lecture. So the last number I saw for current student loan delinquency rate was 12.2%.
Yeah.
If that number continues to rise, which I assume it will, how will higher education be affected?
Yeah, well, the question is, and this is something I think we're just starting to get a picture of, is do those loans tend to be concentrated around certain sectors of higher education? The Brookings study that came out in 2015 suggests absolutely that they are. It says that they are disproportionately products of for-profit higher ed in the first place, and then there's a secondary place in the community college system. If that type of a concentration plays out and there's a collapse for whatever reason, if there's an unsustainable point seen where people are simply not able to pay back loans, I think there's going to be a regulatory crackdown as well as possibly other crackdowns on those types of institutions well beyond what we have today. That's where I think the disruption comes. On the other side, if you have really high-end elite institutions or even major state university systems, I think are going to be much more insulated from that simply because they have more stable funding sources and tend to be more politically connected, but also tend to have students with better loan pictures than those that are concentrated at some of the weaker institutions.
Okay, going back to the chart which said how many professors were hired by each department.
Right.
Could you explain why is it that that there are more professors in the humanities department than, say, business or engineering?
Yeah, that's where I think that's actually a feature of the Gen Ed courses that I mentioned. For various reasons over the past 30 years, humanities departments have managed to establish kind of their stake in the general curriculum by everyone has to take 2 semesters of English, 1 semester of history, 1 semester of philosophy, and so forth. And it shifted the teaching toward that. So there's still a demand for that type of teaching. There's still a need for faculty that do that type of a thing. And as the student body itself has increased, what does that mean? Well, more people have to take those courses, especially if they're written into the curriculum as required as part of the general rounded education. So that's where I think you get the driver of some of the growth in those sectors. Then a little bit of it is going to be kind of rent-seeking effects that also play out.
So I just want to start off and say, just for sake of transparency, I've actually worked in this whole thing that you're talking about, rent-seeking specifically. I've been a part of,
you've been a rent seeker, or you?
Yes, exactly. Been a rent seeker and been a part of organizations that focus on this type of rent seeking.
Yeah.
And then also on the flip side, I actually worked for the accreditation process.
Yeah.
Specifically ACCJC in the community college system.
Okay.
So it sounds like you're very familiar with that.
Yeah.
So my question is, accreditation fundamentally is a voluntary process.
Right.
At the end of the day, it's not the money is required. They're not required to follow accreditation. But when you tell your students that you can't afford to pay professors because you decided not to follow a federal regulation or a Department of Education stipulation on their federal funding mechanism,
What's a pathway to insolvency for a university?
Yeah, basically. And every institution that we know of that, like Corinthian college system, they fell apart once they lost their federal financial aid. So in accreditation, so I just want to say, the federal funding mechanism, it seems like it's more of an incentive than it is a stick.
I think it's both a carrot and a stick.
Yeah.
At this point out. So accreditation does offer this great pool of money and access to students that can take in that money. And those institutions that have bucked the accreditation system or elements of it, there are a few colleges that operate slightly on the outskirts of it, or they reject some federal money. They all have independent financial structures to pay for students to go through them. So you either have to have that in place, or else you are losing the incentive. But you're also losing the stick because the federal government can choose to crack down on regulators, which is what happened with Corinthian and ITT Tech recently. So it works both ways. The big thing there is that you get huge amounts of money that are tied to accreditation, to the point that you can lose an institution's reputation. And if you're not Harvard, if you're not Yale, and you don't have a multi-million, if not billion-dollar endowment that some of these institutions have, that's like a death blow.
Hi.
Yes, sir.
Do you feel like a lot of the people in these rent-seeking kind of positions that are growing, these administrative type of positions, do you think most of them understand that they could possibly be a drain on the system and that they don't care, or that they just don't quite realize that what they're doing might not be the best for the university system as a whole?
Let me pose another hypothetical to you, or even realistic. How many of you have been to the DMV? How many of you think that the person in the DMV line just absolutely hates you and is a horrible human being and is there to ruin your... Probably not. They're probably just trying to do a job, and it's a paying job. It's something that they work in. So they aren't necessarily malicious in the act that they do, but the institutional structure operates in such a way that it creates very perverse incentives for the job. And I think academia works in a very similar way. So you don't get administrators that are out to rob students, but by necessity, the money that they use and dispense comes out of the students' pockets, because at the end of the day, the students are the consumers.
One more question.
Hi. Thank you for a very interesting lecture. I missed the beginning of it, so I apologize if I repeat something that was already there. I wonder whether you had the chance to compare the American structure, because you're all talking about American structure, to the European one.
Right.
Where, I mean, my knowledge of that European system is very superficial, but what I've noticed, it's less of a hybrid. It's all public. Like, there's no students don't pay for most of there's no tuition, so it's all publicly funded. And for what I have seen, it doesn't give them the same flexibility. But at the same time, I haven't seen such an explosion of what you're talking about, administrative bloat. There's certainly the facilities are bare bones, more centered on education.
Less campus life type stuff.
Exactly. Certainly, you don't see lazy rivers or anything of the sort. So I wonder whether you've kind of ventured.
So this may be book number 2 after the first one has taken off and become a bestseller, hopefully. Probably not, but it's academic publishing. I have looked at a couple of individual features. One of the faculty members that I studied under was on the main accrediting body for the European Union as a U.S. advisor to it. So I've looked at bits and pieces of it. You're absolutely right that they are much more bare bones institutions. Very few, if any of them, have like standardized sports teams, for example. That's another huge expense that we see in here. And I touched briefly on it, but sports are generally money losers for universities, whether you like them or not. But go home and propose getting rid of sports, college sports, to someone who's a fan. See how popular that is. But yeah, you absolutely see different institutional structures there. There are some things that are a little bit more bureaucratized that I've seen, including the way that research is handled or promotions are handled among faculty. Also differences in funding structures, because one of the features that we do see in Europe far more often than the U.S., students and faculty both go on strike much more frequently. Or have major protest-type disruptions that are often tied to some sort of the financial equation. But that comes part and parcel with a system that's almost entirely in the public sector. So with that, I think we're out of time, but thank you.